Have you ever wondered if the things you think are making you happy are actually making you miserable? What does it say about our society, folks, that we have the highest purchasing power and quality of life of any humans in recorded history, yet we also have the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and just generally terrible mental health? I don't know about you, and maybe I'm biased because of my deep and slightly disturbing obsession with medieval history, but I'm starting to think the answer to our problems might involve returning to a simpler, perhaps even more medieval way of living. I'm John, and this is Medieval Mindset, the channel where we take medieval principles and learn how to apply them to modern life. And today, we're talking about mental health in the Middle Ages. We're going to learn about what medieval people thought caused mental illness, how they treated it, and whether their way of life might have actually been better for mental well-being. Strap in, because I'm about to nuke all of your preconceived notions about medieval life and replace them with a beautiful array of glorious truth nuggets. If we could take a time machine back to high or late medieval Europe, there are a few things that would strike us immediately. For one, it would probably smell pretty crazy. People would be more comfortable walking around with a level of stank that these days you would only find in a Magic the Gathering tournament. Besides that, the thing that might really shock us is just how communal life was. When I say communal, you might be thinking of your local town fair or the church potluck or the YMCA or whatever the word community brings to mind for you, but I'm gonna need you to take it a step further. In the Middle Ages, communal meant that every aspect of life was shared. People in medieval villages lived in these incredibly tightly knit communities where everyone had a place and everyone knew each other. You've probably seen medieval movies where a criminal on trial is given the option of either exile or execution as their punishment, and to us, exile seems like the easy and obvious choice, but to a medieval person, it wouldn't have been so clear-cut. To be exiled from your village wasn't just a punishment, it could be a death sentence because your community was your identity, your protection, and your support system. People worshiped together, worked together, celebrated together, and they even lived together in multi-generational homes. Privacy, as we think of it today, was almost non-existent. Historian Barbara Tuchman, in A Distant Mirror, wrote that medieval people lived so closely intertwined with their kin and neighbors that solitude was nearly impossible, and loneliness, as we know it today, was rare. Although this constant togetherness might sound like hell to us modern introverts, it actually created an unshakable support network. It's also worth noting that if a complete lack of privacy is all you've ever known, then privacy wouldn't necessarily be something you would miss. Even in the most extreme form of communal living, which would have been convents and monasteries, this principle was at play. The 12th century monk Jocelyn de Bragelonne described monastic life like this: each man, whether baker or brewer, carpenter or smith, contributed his skill to the needs of the whole house, and none went without, for the strength of one was the strength of all. Outside of monasteries, feudal society also just naturally fostered a sense of interdependence. Guilds weren't just cool trade organizations for dudes who loved doing crafts. They were brotherhoods where members were expected to care for one another, especially in times of sickness or distress. If a blacksmith suffered a mental breakdown, his guild brothers would step in to provide financial and emotional support, making sure that he didn't lose everything. Now compare that to today, where so many of us live alone, we spend all day working in isolation, and then after work we just kind of scroll endlessly on our phones instead of talking to actual people. The US Surgeon General has even declared loneliness a public health epidemic, linking it to higher risks of heart disease, dementia, stroke, anxiety, and depression. But medieval people didn't need scientific studies to convince them of the benefits of community. Common sense and necessity led them to build a way of life where no one was truly alone. And what about information overload? We know too much. We've become too conscious. You don't have an internal monologue anymore, it's just an algorithm. Medieval people weren't bombarded with a 24-hour news cycle telling them about every war, scandal, leaked nude, or disaster happening anywhere in the world at any given moment. They got their news from travelers at inns, messengers in town squares, even the occasional soldier returning from war. For example, when King Edward III invaded France in 1346, he recruited 15,000 soldiers from all over England, and these guys traveled by foot from their villages to the closest ports, sailed across the Channel, and then returned months or years later with stories of what they had seen, which they would tell to anyone they met on the way home. That's how news spread, word of mouth, brought to you by a real person who was probably actually there. There were also long periods of daily silence for most people. Medieval life had a lot of natural pauses, whether it was sitting by the candlelight after the sun had gone down, or long walks through the countryside, or even just the slow pace of life compared to today's constant screeching wall of noise and information. Monks even set aside time for regular periods of silence, which not only helped with their spiritual discipline, but may have also given them a sense of mental clarity and peace. Nowadays, we get most of our news from Reddit or chronically online influencers, which only really serves to make ourselves sick over things we can't control. Maybe ignorance really was bliss. Speaking of which, let's talk about what people in the Middle Ages thought of mental illness. Treatment varied considerably depending on the severity and what was thought to be causing it. Medieval physicians took a more holistic approach, believing that mental health was tied to physical well-being. Many physicians believed mental illness stemmed from imbalances in the four humors, which was an idea inherited from ancient Greece. Terms like frenzy instead of mania, or melancholy, which we know as depression, or lethargy, which is stupor. They all describe conditions that we recognize today. The Persian physician Avicenna's Canon of Medicine spoke of melancholia as fear without cause, quick anger, and sadness, which is essentially an early description of clinical depression. Medieval doctors understood that disorders like these were linked to the brain. Remedies usually included herbal concoctions, dietary regimens, and lifestyle modifications like more sleep, more time in the countryside, exercise, or less alcohol. And one notable case from the 13th century, a French physician named Bernard of Gordon treated a melancholic patient by advising him to spend more time in gardens and to listen to soft music. And that's not some mystical cure. He understood that environmental changes could have a profound impact on mood. Hospitals, such as Bethlehem Hospital in London, which became known as Bedlam, started housing mentally ill patients as early as the 14th century. And a lot of monasteries and religious hospitals also took in the mentally ill, not just out of charity, but because Christian doctrine emphasized caring for the suffering. Some, like the hospitals of the Order of St. John's, even provided structured care that combined medical treatment with religious practices like prayer and fasting. This is gonna sound crazy, but feudal lords in some cases were actually expected to care for their mentally struggling serfs, although class played a pretty important role in what kind of mental health treatment you could expect. The nobility would usually keep mentally ill family members at home, away from public scrutiny, or send them quietly off to monasteries for treatment. Both of these options usually resulted in more compassionate, humane treatment. When King Henry VI of England went through a mental breakdown, and who could blame him, he inherited the crown from his father, arguably the greatest English monarch who ever lived, he was cared for within royal palaces and kept in seclusion until he recovered. Those from the lower classes who went through mental crises could expect to end up in some sort of municipal custody, sort of like a psychiatric hold today. Like in the German city of Nuremberg, where records show dozens of cases between 1377 and 1492, where town authorities spent money on the insane, paying for their food and lodging. The legal system also recognized mental illness. The 1324 Prerogativa Regis law in England distinguished between idiots, or people born with cognitive disabilities, and lunatics, those who suffered periodic episodes of insanity. While the king could take control of a lunatic's estate during their illness, the law mandated that it be restored if they recovered, which was an early legal recognition of temporary mental health conditions. Of course, not everything was so rosy. Women's mental illnesses were often dismissed as demonic possession or divine punishment. That said, the large-scale witch hunts came after the medieval period, not during it. But what's the takeaway? Medieval people weren't ignorant about mental health. Their approach was imperfect, but in many ways surprisingly compassionate, practical, and holistic. So did medieval people actually have better mental health than us? The answer's complicated. Yes, they lived in a more natural, more communal, more purposeful world, but they also faced plagues, war, famine, and early death. There's no doubt they experienced hardship. But the key difference is how they processed and coped with it. They weren't alone. They weren't drowning in overstimulation. They weren't numbing themselves with endless distraction. They lived, and their lives were in tune with the natural rhythms of the earth. Even though they were just living the only way they knew how, they might have stumbled onto something we desperately need to reclaim. What do you think? Did medieval people have a better chance of good mental health than we do, or are we looking at the past through rose-tinted glasses? If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to this channel, Medieval Mindset, for more deep dives into medieval history and what it can teach us today. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one.